sat and listened to all of the exchanges, and it's been very illuminating, and I think there were significant kind of points of confirmation of key issues that we as committee members have been concerned about and grappling with. I mean, I think, John O'Mahony, you made a good phrase. We must be sure that the LDA doesn't lose the run of itself, and the bill needs to constrain that. But we also must make sure that we don't lose the run of ourselves. And in the kind of complexity that seems to be around the establishment of the LDA, we don't create another monster that will actually add to the layers rather than take away the barriers and objectives to addressing the housing crisis. And I think, we have to remind ourselves the context of this. There are 10,000 people in emergency accommodation. 3,750 of those are children. Okay, we have 72,000 people on local authority waiting lists, and we have many more people in extortionate and prohibitive rent situations. That's today. So whatever else the LDA does, it has to address that. And I would welcome your affirmation that that has to be its kind of key and main objective in all the complexities. I welcome the focus on the mix. According to the summary of social housing assessments for 2018, of the 72,000 households on the local authority waiting list, 47%, almost half, are single-person households. So if we're addressing crises, we have to address that. Of the 10,000 people who are in emergency accommodation, just over 4,000 are single homeless households. So in whatever mix, whatever outcome of the LDA's work is, that must be A, address homelessness, and B, address the kind of housing that would address that homelessness. Important reflections as well around the ageing population. I'm living in a house that's too big for me now because my children have left home. A lot of us are in that place. You look around and you say, could I downsize? And you don't often see stock. Older people and people with disabilities as well living in those mixed communities that you described. Sustainability is really important. I was delivering a wedding present on Sunday night to my niece who lives in Ballincollig, and her house is at the edge of Ballincollig. There was a car in front of every single house, if not two. So, if we are serious about climate change, we need to reverse that trend of the sprawl and of people needing cars to be able to go to work. So, so interested in your thoughts on the objects and and the complexity in addressing the objectives, which is to end homelessness for those 10,000 people at the very minimum, to get the right kinds of houses in the right places that are good for people, but also for our communities. Also, given that we are proposing such a significant handover of public assets, and Deputy Casey talked about 1.25 billion, that's a huge transfer. And in the ratios proposed, we're talking about 10% social housing, which would be in the ownership of the state. That's 15,000 houses. Now, I'm not a business person, but that doesn't seem to me like a great deal. So I'd again be interested in your views on that. How we nail down affordability. As somebody said at a previous meeting, affordability is if you can afford to pay for it. So it's a very relative term. So how do we gravitate towards a cost model? Because housing is far more than a commodity or something to be traded. It is the very roof over your head where you can rear a family, go to school, live a life, get a job. And I'm concerned about the giveaway of huge amounts of public assets, which are now belong to all of us, for a return that is very small in terms of public ownership. I'm interested in the Copenhagen model, and again, if you have any details on that, I think it would be something that we would like to look at as a committee. I'm also very interested in the whole apprenticeships idea. And as some of you may be aware, I'm doing a lot of work around traveller rights and focus on traveller issues. There's 80% unemployment among travellers. So it would seem to be like a no-brainer for CIF and the engineers and the architects and others to reach out to that community, because it's only 40,000 people anyway. And I think that would be an enormous benefit. You know, there have been traditions of craft and making in that community, which have sadly been lost, but there could be interesting connections made, and other hard-to-reach communities as well. I know people who work in Youth Reach, for example, and the people going through those programmes are crying out for the kinds of work that there seems to be shortages in. So I'd be interested in your comments on those. Thank you.
Looking at the senators, looking at the numbers that you mentioned, the 10,000 that we currently have that are homeless, I mean, that is one of the most shocking indictments of our current of the country at the moment. But unfortunately, we've an extra million people that are going to be living on the island of Ireland in the next 40 to 50 years. So we need to take a really strong long-term view. And you made reference to your niece living in Ballincollig and the outskirts of it. We're not talking about moving somebody from the outskirts of Ballincollig to a different location. We're talking about that we need to strengthen and increase the density within Ballincollig and the infrastructure that is there. And that's why I think we believe that the LDA is so important, that we need to have a state agency that will identify the sites, some of our suburban sites, look at purchasing suburban sites. Maybe it's through CPOs, maybe it's looking at existing social housing and really strengthening the density that is there. We did a study in relation to the ageing population about 2 years ago, and there's about 950,000 homes on the island of Ireland that are under-occupied. We have to find a way of unlocking those. And I think that's where we believe the LDA could come in, purchasing large tracts of land, purchasing through CPOs or whatever model it is, the existing suburban housing and looking at strengthening it. John, do you want to talk about the study that we're looking at in Limerick? Or is that?
Yeah, we're doing a densification study. The Institute are trying to look 50 years ahead, beyond 2040, to try and come back to look seriously at what all of our main cities might look like in 50 years' time, and to identify where the opportunities are. And it's taking a wider view. We hope to publish that. It's going to take us about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years to do, but we're going to do it in detail. A couple of quick questions. 10,000 people homeless.
In emergency.
Yeah,
more homeless, actually.
As a citizen, I cannot understand why 10,000 relative to the size of the country isn't a big figure. I would have thought there's an opportunity for the LDA to actually try and look nationwide at how to actually try and kill that as a first off most important element. That's a personal view. And in a country that's as wealthy as we are, I'm still quite shocked that we haven't managed to solve that one. About the nature of our communities and the nature of what we're putting into our developments, if you look at that, 80% of our housing stock is family houses and 38% of the population are families. So we've a huge oversupply of family housing. And there's a huge rebalancing to be done in order that we can create more balanced communities. And I think when it comes to new developments, the old model seemed to be you just put in 3 beds and 4 beds. And you didn't match it to what the actual community base was. Whereas nowadays, we should be capable of being much more forensic about what goes on to each site from a local point of view. So there should be a percentage of housing for older people, a percentage of first-time starter homes, so that people stay in the community. You can actually live your entire life in one community. I think we need to be more forensic about how we design and lay out our estates. I have a question which is almost a question to direct that the committee might look at, and that is when the LDA was first promoted, when the first document came out identifying what the LDA would do. It had two functions. One was as a land development agency, take public land, develop it efficiently, etc. The second part of it, to me, seemed to be a really interesting issue, and that was to follow a Dutch and German model, which was that it would have the powers to, if you want, designate areas as regeneration areas, to purchase the land at that land value cost, and then to develop it out over time. As the value goes up, you share it with the landowners, and that you develop it out. What it was proposed to do was that the LDA would have a bank of land that, in the event of a recession, they would be able to work through a recession. But also, it was an element that might control the price of land. And that's disappeared completely from any of the legislation that I've seen.
Do you think that should come back into the frame?
I think it would be worth going back and having a look at what the remit was supposed to be originally. It would be interesting to know why it didn't proceed, whether it was for legal reasons or for land ownership reasons. But it's a model that has worked extremely successfully in Holland, particularly, where they've delivered nearly 500,000 units over a period of about 25 years, which are affordable and social.
Just in one point, in relation to housing for the ageing population, I think it's very important that the LDA would also have responsibility or involvement in unlocking smaller sites within towns and villages where you can build 2-person units that would enable people then to move down. I mean, when we did our research, it was very clear so many people are interested in trading down, but there's nothing within their local environment, local village or town to do it. So if the LDA can look, and it probably won't be the most economic way of doing it, but it has long-term potential for the viability for towns and villages. Thank you.
Caroline or
Kieran, sorry.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Senator Kelleher, for your comments. Certainly, in relation to the example that you gave of your niece and Ballincollig, we would be very much ad idem with you in relation to, again, emphasising the role of sustainable development and the role that the LDA can play in that regard. In our submission, we've explicitly said or recommended a change to the bill. We have said that we believe developing sustainable communities must be a fundamental objective of the LDA, and that should be included in Head 8, Section 2, so that all of the subsequent development that we see has that sustainable aspect in all of the development that goes forward in that regard. So we would, as I say, we would certainly be of similar mind to you. Again, in relation to the homelessness crisis, as my colleague from the Architects has said, it's something that absolutely has to be addressed, and the LDA can form, and it's one of the main reasons why we have welcomed the LDA. We feel that if it's implemented properly, and if it coordinates the land banks and is able to add to the underused land in the public sector and put that together with land from the private sector, that we should be able to, as a country, we should be able to address that in a timely fashion. So we feel, and we're supporting the implementation or the development of the LDA in that regard, because it is clearly a mechanism that can help us to address some of those. Thank you.
Anya or Patrick?
Sure, I think like everything else that we talk about with housing, everything is complex and it's influenced by other legislation. So you make the point really well about the household sizes that we're dealing with, which are diminishing all the time. And Ronan Lyons reported about 3 years ago, to squeals of indignation, stop building 3-bed, 4-bed houses, because frankly, we have too many of them. And we need apartments, we need duplexes, we need different densification models, for sure. The difficulty you have is getting people to buy into those types of units, because our underlying legislation, the Multi-Unit Development Act, which was passed in 2011, was a good start to that legislation, but itself needs to be overhauled to encourage the common good concept that there are in more mature markets when you've got apartment schemes, so that one person can't undermine the occupants, the enjoyment to everybody else's detriment. So there is something about that, to be honest with you.
The greater emphasis on the common
Absolutely.
In terms of the framing legislation for the LDA, perhaps.
For sure, for sure. So like, there's so many things that influence, you know, how you provide housing, not just the cost of it, not just where you put it, but actually, will people go? Will they want to live in it? Will they feel that actually, if I have the same front door as 10 other people and one of those people is actually going to cause mayhem, then I don't want to be there. And so there'll be a resistance to move into that type of thing. So that underlying legislation around that, we've already discussed this with the department. And as I say, 2011 was a good start, but it definitely needs revision at this point in time. The points about population growth are really, really important. Again, going back to that concept of mapping what we have, then where is everybody going to live? If our population actually grows to that extent, we need modelling, we need trends, and we need that data-driven evidence to underpin our policy around housing and everything else, and infrastructure will be the same. I think maybe the LDA is the agency that's targeted with that public ownership target. So the likes of Vienna has a 60% public ownership target. At all times, we retain 60% of our housing stock in public ownership, and that isn't quantified about social or affordable. It's just public housing. If you can afford to rent at a reasonable market rent, that is what the unit will be rented to you at, but it's retained in public ownership. Now, they did that over 100 years, so we're not going to do it over 10 or 20 or 30, but it's definitely something that could be an initial target, and then that's sort of staged out over a 5-10-year incremental basis, and the LDA could be the organisation certainly to look over that. I think Catherine makes a really good point about smaller, because we have so many small clusters in this country. But if our local authorities aren't today using the powers that they have to acquire sites in their own jurisdictional areas, then that's an issue, because they actually can do it today. If they have a proper purpose to buying sites in small towns, then they should be using that. And again, it could be a performance measure that the LDA is tasked to provide, that they actually do the performance appraisals of local authorities to ensure that they're utilising whatever means that they can on their own lands or on adjacent lands or whatever that might be.
Okay. James or John?
Thank you, Senator. I suppose just on some of the points there, I suppose we're all probably uncertain about how the actual makeup of the LDA will be rolled out at this point in time. If the principles as we would see it would be that it's going to provide increased output, it's going to unlock the state lands, it's going to remove that finance barrier that's currently existing in regional pockets, and that can help ultimate delivery, that you would feel would go some way towards addressing some of the homelessness, albeit that it won't be the silver bullet to that. On the ageing population, I think again that's why one of the points that we've made, the early intervention or the early association with the professional bodies and with industry will be key with the LDA. I suppose there's a lot of awareness out there when you connect with the demographics in an ageing population of what's actually required for an ageing population, age-friendly construction, the elements that we require that can be implemented at a very early design stage, and some of the other associations and bodies will be more abreast of this than what we would. But you know, how it's designed at relatively low cost at the outset in the design, incorporate some of those design elements for conversion of attics, you know, joists at first floor level, allowing for extensions, that sort of thing. If that's done at if that's done at an early stage at design, it can allow, I suppose, refurbishment or extensions or whatever at a later stage at a less cost and a prohibitive fashion. So again, the early involvement of the professional bodies and ourselves with the LDA at design stage, I think, will be key on that. And another, I suppose, it's part of the whole conversation, the whole body, and even the word of warning when we talk about an ageing population. We have a huge cohort that are in rental accommodation. And what's going to happen to that cohort when they're at a position where they're out of work and they're about to retire? They will no longer be in a position where they can afford rent. And at the moment, with the affordability gaps that we have, and we do see, we don't have a position where we can get them onto the mortgage and onto the property ladder. And that's going to be a stark reality in years to come, to those that are currently in rent, won't be able to afford rent, and then there's going to be an extra burden on state. Yeah. So that's why we would call again for the likes of the shared equity scheme, a re-look at the rules, all the things around it, the mortgage and the restrictions that are currently there on it. And I suppose finally again, and the Federation and the IHBA have a very proactive piece and a shared concern around the whole apprenticeships, and we're doing a huge amount of work, so we'll be happy to share any of the information and some of the initiatives and the future campaign that's about to kick off on that. And that is open to all sectors of the industry and society, and we'd encourage all those from all fronts to get involved with it, so we'll happily share around all information on that front as well.
Thank you very much.
Just one final point. I think Deputy O'Brien, Senator Keller, he mentioned about the DAC and was the appropriate entity for the for something that isn't probably profit-based, that's more social-based. And you mentioned then about the objects of, you know, in your opening statement, about the objects of the LDA. And I think it's perfectly plausible that, you know, the objects, like every company has a constitution, or what we used to call memorandum and articles of association, but the objects of a company can be quite specific. They don't all have to be profit-based, or they don't all have to be, you know, it can be, you can say our objective is to deliver housing, whatever tenure, whether it's social, affordable and so on. It doesn't have to be too overly prescriptive in the context of, you know, it has to be X amount private and Y amount social. I mean, that can be, you know, there can be wording put around that to make it flexible. But just that, I mean, the objects is one of the concerns you have, is that you want this to be predominantly state-led housing delivery. I think one of the points, just to touch on one of the points about homelessness, and something that was all very, look, it's a real issue. I think there's a huge issue around the management of our public-owned housing stock. You know, you mentioned yourself, you know, I know loads of people living in a large house where there's only 2 people living in it, and you've got a family of 4 or 5 living in a hotel room. You know, there is something wrong with that model, and it's not as if we don't have enough of roofs in the country to house that 10,000 people. It's just the way we're managing the stock. I mean, the first house I bought in Dublin 20 years ago was a council house, and I paid probably 25 times the price that the vendors paid for it. So retention and recycling and efficient management of the housing, of the public-owned housing stock, is key to the homeless problem that we mentioned. And I think the LDA, if it is going to deliver social and affordable housing, that has to be retained. We go back to the point about leasing it. I think, John, you touched on it, but it is a key point, and it needs to be retained and kept in public control and managed properly.